Over the last century, British Airways has become one of our most iconic companies.
Well, it was a crème de la crème, as my mother would say.
It launched the world's first international flight service.
It was the start of a new era for the whole of aviation, really.
The first jetliner.
It completely revolutionised air travel.
And the first ever supersonic passenger plane.
Once you'd flown on Concorde, it was like being a member of an exclusive club.
But it has also faced very turbulent times.
I thought, well, this is it. They're going to blow us up.
Has struggled to keep up with the competition.
I don't care what fare you've got, mine is the cheapest.
And been forced to make tough decisions in order to survive.
This was not just some nice, cuddly British airline, but this was a world leader.
This is the story of a thoroughly British airline and its first 100 years in the sky. British Airways now carries over 40 million passengers a year. The country's largest air fleet has its main hub at Heathrow, Europe's busiest international airport. But the story of our flagship carrier starts a century ago in a muddy West London field. Hounslow Heath Aerodrome had been a training base for the Royal Flying Corps during the First World War. At the end of the war, the airport was converted for civilian use and took its place in aviation history.
We're right under the flight path to Heathrow. It's just a mile or so away to the north and the west. But this is the place where modern passenger flying started. Not at Heathrow, but here on Hounslow Heath. Because it was here that the first scheduled international passenger flight took off for Paris.
Aircraft Transport and Travel, forerunner of British Airways, launched the first flight of the world's first international schedule on the 25th of August 1919.
There would have been a lot of people here just to watch this extraordinary thing of a plane taking off, actually taking someone to Paris. Very few people had been in a plane, and it was probably as exciting as anything you could do.
The Vintage Aircraft Club have a realistic scale model of Hounslow Heath Aerodrome, originally produced to mark the 50th anniversary of this seminal moment in aviation history.
It was the start of something brand new and a new era for the whole of aviation, really.
The plane used on this pioneering flight was the Airco de Havilland 4A.
It was a fabric and wood aeroplane, had an open cockpit, single engine, and they'd actually been designed in the war for bombs.
And there is a surviving account of that groundbreaking journey.
Well, we're very fortunate because we have a copy of Flight magazine from 1949, and they interviewed Lieutenant Bill Lawford, who was the pilot of that first flight. He said, "It was a grim morning with heavy rain and practically no visibility. Lawford hedge-hopped all the way to the coast. Over the channel, he flew at no feet, narrowly missing a lightship, but visibility improved towards the French coast. Remember, this is an open cockpit aircraft with minimal instruments and no radio. On landing at Le Bourget, the gendarmerie approached, kissed the pilot and said, 'Alors, mon vieux, bien fait? Votre passeport, s'il vous plaît.' The flight had taken 2 hours and 15 minutes.
To begin with, the carrier, Aircraft Transport and Travel, operated a successful schedule.
Apparently, out of the first 42 flights, the first 41 flights arrived exactly on time to the minute. And from May to December, they actually flew 4,000 passengers over that time, which is incredible when you think that it's just a small airline in a small place with small aeroplanes compared to what we know now.
But AT&T didn't last long. Just a year after that historic first flight, the fledgling airline was out of business, with its assets taken over by the Daimler Airway. The whole industry was struggling in the UK, and that was a problem for a government that wanted an air carrier which would reflect Britain's standing in the world, and, more importantly, would allow the country to strengthen its grip on an empire which now covered nearly a quarter of the global population.
I think the government realised that if they could create a national airline that was big enough and powerful enough with enough planes, it could hold the empire together.
In 1924, the government approached 4 British carriers, including Daimler, with a huge financial offer to combine forces under the banner of Imperial Airways.
The government was saying, here's £1 million, join together. So it was an offer they couldn't refuse. And they loved the fact the government was saying, we're going to make you Imperial Airways. You're going to dominate the world.
The staggering £1 million cash injection pushed the airline to new heights. In the years ahead, they would launch the world's biggest ever passenger biplane. They would go on to run a crucial undercover mission in the Second World War. But how would they recover from their first ever fatal crash? Modern global aviation giant British Airways can trace its origins back to Imperial Airways, formed in 1924 when the government brought together 4 struggling domestic carriers with the promise of a £1 million cash injection. The new airline was due to launch from Croydon Airport, with a purpose-built terminal including the world's first ever air traffic control tower on April Fool's Day 1924. But the joke would be on Imperial's customers.
Their operations were supposed to start on the 1st of April 1924, but there was actually a bit of an industrial dispute at the time that took another 3 weeks to resolve before they could all agree on how much everyone was going to get paid. So that delayed the operations until the 26th of April before they'd actually start flying the services.
Just 9 months later, Imperial Airways suffered a much more serious setback. On Christmas Eve 1924, one of their planes nosedived from a low altitude, crashed and burst into flames. This was a big story. Newspaper accounts tell of passers-by who valiantly strove to smash the fuselage of the plane and release the imprisoned passengers, but were forced to abandon their efforts on account of the terrific heat. All 8 people on board died.
At the time, this is Britain's worst aviation accident, and various recommendations came out of that air accident investigation. And one of those was that the airport should be made safer, and it would need to be enlarged to do that.
By 1928, Croydon Airport had become the world-beating base needed by an airline with global ambitions.
What we've got is the world's first ever modern airport terminal. It's the first time there's been a specifically built check-in area. So you come in, you go to your prospective airline desk to check in and get your ticket. You'll then go through security, immigration and customs. Then you'll go out the one departure gate they had here to get onto the airliner, and that would all be done in about 10 minutes.
Away, Chocks!
This was the world's biggest air traffic control tower and was a complete step change on what there was before. It's this massive structure, it's 50 feet tall. There's nothing else like it on the planet.
But communications between the controllers in the tower and planes on the runway outside were still very much stuck in the 1920s.
We're on the balcony of the air traffic control tower. This is where the traffic assistant would have come to pass the instructions to the aircraft. First of all, they have an indicator board for each airline. So for an Imperial Airways, they have the letter I, and that'll be slotted down into this slot here.
This sign means that an Imperial Airways machine is about to leave.
The pilots would actually look at that board and think, right, that's our turn, we're next up to go.
The airport official then gets clearance from controllers sitting just inside that the plane can taxi away from the terminal building.
He would then use the light to shine it down to the traffic assistant on the apron, who would then wave off the airliner to actually move out and go onto the runway. Once he's out on the airfield, the next signal that the pilot would get would be again from the spotlight here to actually shine it at the cockpit to the pilot to say you're now clear to take off.
By the time the new Croydon facilities had opened, Imperial had replaced its original fleet of converted World War I bombers with custom-built passenger planes, though the in-flight experience was still rather different to the modern British Airways.
Under the passenger seats, there would have been a pot for when you threw up because it was so bumpy. And if you needed to use the loo, it was a curtain with a bucket behind it. So you can imagine if you were doing that and the plane hit really bad weather, the bucket and you might go toppling over. So it was very primitive, but no one worried about that because you could look out the window and this incredible thing.
Lovely clear, doesn't it?
In millions of years of human history, no one had looked out the window and go, good heavens, there's the English Channel, there's, you know, Croydon. This was extraordinary.
Imperial Airways' early planes might not have been particularly comfortable, but flying on them certainly wasn't cheap. In the mid-20s, a single ticket to Paris cost about £9, roughly twice the average weekly wage. The company's well-heeled passengers expected high-end service for their hard-earned cash. So, in 1927, Imperial introduced their world-renowned Silver Wing service.
I mean, it was an extraordinary service, even by the standards of flying first class today. If you booked your ticket for the Silver Wing service, a car, and it would be a big luxury car, would turn up at your house in the morning and it would drive to within a few feet of the steps to the plane.
There they would be met by a Silver Wing service air steward, another British first.
At that time, they were all men. They had amazing customer service and they looked smart. They had these starched collars, as if you were a maitre d' in a restaurant.
The in-flight catering would set the standard for years to come.
The stewards would buy all their food that they needed fresh, and then there was a tiny room at the back of the plane where they had a kind of very small area to prepare and a small hob where they could warm food up.
At Croydon, you can still see an original Imperial Airways place setting.
This is some of what you would have on a Silver Wing service. It's all got the crests of the Imperial Airways. The crockery is china, and it's a very fine china, which means it's lightweight, but it's not the sort of plastic you get on long-haul flights today. You had your full cutlery, you had proper crockery. The whole thing was very luxurious, as you would expect to have if you were having a 5-course dinner in the Champs-Élysées or somewhere.
Not only did this pre-war manifestation of British Airways offer a new standard of service, they were also front-runners in in-flight entertainment.
They were innovators, and in 1925, they showed the first, certainly in Europe, the first in-flight movie, and it was The Lost World, a Conan Doyle story. The projector was in the aisle, and there was a tiny aisle, and there were 2 rows of seats. They just had a screen at the front of the cockpit. I mean, it would have been very small, maybe 3 or 4 feet square. Many people said to me, how on earth did they hear the soundtrack? Well, of course, that was easy. It was a silent film.
Imperial was working hard to attract more passengers, but the government had created the airline in the first place to tighten their grip on the British colonies scattered throughout the world. A new kind of aeroplane was needed.
This is the first of a fleet of 8 giant Handley Page airliners built for the Empire Air routes operated by Imperial Airways.
The HP-42 and its sister ship, the HP-45, was commissioned by Imperial Airways to actually provide transport not only through Europe, but also to extend the operation to cover the whole of Britain's overseas interests, to go all the way down through Africa, through the Middle East, and onwards to India as well.
The new flagship of Britain's leading airline had a whole series of innovative features to make long-haul flights both safer and more reliable.
We actually see an enclosed cockpit, which was a first for an airliner. Up until then, the pilots were exposed to the weather. For the first time, we see 4 engines on one of their airliners. From 1928 onwards, they insisted that all their airliners would have 4 engines because that improved the safety of the aircraft. The aircraft can now seat 38 people. Imperial Airways' biggest airliner up until then actually seated 20 people. As you can see, there's a huge change in capacity.
During the past 4 years, a fleet of 8 of these has carried passengers throughout the Empire, over 8 million miles, and carried them without any injury whatsoever.
The HP-42 was designed with some of the home comforts needed to make long-haul travel a more appealing prospect.
You've got a luxurious cabin. There's a galley in the centre of the aircraft where the steward will be based to serve the customers on the flight. And this is the first time an actual airliner was designed with a toilet on board. It was the most advanced and the best airliner there was at the time.
As flight times soared, the strain was starting to show on British bottoms. Something had to give, and it would be the padding on specially designed aeroplane seating.
This is an original passenger chair that Imperial Airways would have used on their planes from around about 1920. I wouldn't sit on it now because it's deteriorating, but it's probably comfortable for a short journey. At first it would have just been put on the aircraft. Gradually they then strapped them down just as much to stop the chairs just rolling around when there was no one sat on it.
By the early 30s, frequent flyers were starting to expect airlines to offer as much comfort as their earthbound rivals.
This specific one's from an HP-42. You can see it's drastically different. It's got metal legs, so it's much more weighty. It's upholstered. They're more like the sort of seats that you get in first class in the kind of Pullman train services.
By the time Imperial launched the Ensign in 1938,
they're designed to carry 40 passengers in the comfort for which Imperial Airways have always been famous.
passenger aeroplane production had become an established industry, so designers no longer aped trains. They developed seats specifically to deal with turbulence and bumpy landings.
You've got the headrest, it's comfortable, it's also safer, it's solid, it's the reclining seat. You can recognise it as an airline seat. Sort of less than 20 years, you've come to what is recognisably what you'd sit on today in an airplane.
Imperial focused on long-haul colonial destinations. Then, in 1935, a new domestic rival, a company calling itself British Airways Limited, was set up to compete on the lucrative European routes. This private company had a short-lived career. Its most infamous flight delivered Chamberlain back from meeting Hitler in 1938. The Prime Minister made his notorious appeasement speech at the foot of one of their planes.
The settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace.
Less than a year later, the country was at war. The government nationalised Imperial Airways and British Airways Limited and merged them to form the British Overseas Airways Corporation. During the war, BOAC connected the United Kingdom with its allies around the world, often under enemy fire. The airline also added to its fleet one of Britain's most iconic wartime planes, the de Havilland Mosquito, in one of the most intriguing clandestine operations of the conflict.
The Swedish made the best ball bearings in Europe, and so everybody wanted those for aircraft, for engines, for tanks, for things like that.
But Sweden was a neutral country, so they didn't allow any military aircraft to land on their airfields during the war.
The only way across was by a civilian aircraft, and that's where BOAC came in. The Mosquitoes, similar to the one we have here, were repurposed as BOAC aircraft. They had BOAC markings. They were flown by pilots in BOAC uniforms up to Stockholm to collect cargoes of ball bearings and bring them back to the UK in complete civilian disguise. When the aircraft was being loaded up and it was being refuelled at Stockholm Airport, the pilots and the navigators would have a chance for a quick break and a cup of tea in the cafeteria. And the story goes that they would meet their Lufthansa counterparts there who were over from Germany for exactly the same purpose. Of course, being a neutral country, they weren't allowed to do anything. They were all with civilian guys, and so all they could do was wave each other and say hello and then get back in their aircraft and fly home.
Shortly after the Second World War, Britain's flagship airline would introduce world-beating engine technology until a fatal flaw grounds their entire jet-age fleet. The forerunner of British Airways, the British Overseas Airways Corporation, flew throughout the Second World War, keeping the country in touch with its colonies and allies around the globe. At the end of the war, in 1945,
today is Victory in Europe Day.
Britain emerged battered and bruised and in need of massive reconstruction. But the country was heavily in debt and desperately short of foreign currency. So the state-owned airline would have to make do and mend with aging aircraft and obsolete technology. Like the Dragon Rapide, originally designed in 1934, 5 years before the outbreak of war. This particular aircraft, currently being restored at the de Havilland Museum in Hertfordshire, was intended for military service, but was converted for passenger use and bought by BOAC in October 1945.
It's mainly a plywood box, often referred to rather badly as a tea chest, but still, we will ignore that. It is quite thin, it's only 1.5 millimetre thick.
The wooden structure would have been covered in Irish linen.
It's stretched and pulled over and fixed down and shrunk, and it gives you your appearance of a nice, smooth aircraft. But underneath, the bit that nobody ever sees is this structure.
And the controls hark back to an earlier age of air travel.
It never had very much in the way of electronics. There would have been a very basic radio, and there would have been all the electronic equipment for starting the engine and for navigation lights, but little else really. Everything was still operated by cables with pulleys and levers. There are rudder cables, throttle cables, mixture control cables. Everything's cables. You wouldn't want to sit in it for too long. There's no comfort, bumpy, nice view.
By the early 50s, Britain was still on rations, but across the pond, the US economy was booming. So while UK airlines largely soldiered on with outdated World War II technology, their American rivals were taking their passenger service to new heights. However, their aircraft were still propeller-driven planes with piston engines. That made them noisy and relatively slow. Transatlantic flights would take upwards of 15 hours, with as many as 3 stops. But Britain's state-owned airline industry was still struggling to keep pace.
Emerging from the war with tremendous military air strength, but little civilian, our airlines have since then been striving to make up for lost time.
BOAC flight Bokaro, Karachi, Calcutta, Bangkok.
In 1952, BOAC saw a chance to get its nose back in front of its US rivals. They brought into service the world's first ever passenger jetliner, the British-built de Havilland Comet.
When BOAC inaugurated the first Comet jet flights, it completely revolutionised air travel. It was the Concorde of its day, really.
The new Comet could reach speeds of nearly 500 miles an hour, about 50% faster than equivalent propeller planes.
When you started running down the runway to take off, it was like a Ferrari to a Ford. I mean, you could feel the thrust. And the takeoff was a hell of a lot different angle than on a propeller plane.
And the jet engines provided a much smoother flight as well.
It was a different world, a much more comfortable world, a much more steady world.
The comfort of travelling in these magnificent aircraft has to be experienced to be believed, and when meals are taken, the steadiness of the machine and the lack of vibration can be fully appreciated.
They used to play a trick in the passenger cabins. They used to take a coin, and because of the lack of vibration, the coin would sit on its edge and it wouldn't go anywhere. It just sat on the table. People loved to see that because it was such a novelty.
This new technology also allowed the planes to fly much higher in the sky. Propellers need air to push against, but jet propulsion is actually more efficient in the thinner atmosphere thousands of feet above ground.
Jet engines are designed for high altitude flights. You can fly high, you can fly above the weather.
The Comet transformed passenger travel, but this radical new aircraft had a fatal flaw.
In January and again in April 1954, there were 2 crashes just off the Italian coast. Both of these Comets were lost with everybody on board.
A total of 56 people died in the 2 crashes. The Royal Navy salvaged the planes from the seabed and returned the mangled remains to the UK, where the Ministry of Transport investigated the cause of the disasters.
When they pieced together the wreckage, they discovered that the fuselage had explosively blown apart.
Flying at much greater altitudes meant that the large cabin had to be pressurized for the safety and comfort of the passengers. This put a strain on the body of the Comet, which was repeated with every flight of the new jetliner.
The cause of the accidents was the structural failure of the fuselage caused by metal fatigue and caused by the repeated pressurisation of the fuselage internally.
But this might not have been such a disaster were it not for another design feature of the pioneering jet plane.
If you look at the windows, they're different from a modern airliner in that they're square. Square things, of course, have corners in them, and it was the corners that concentrated the stress when the airframe was pressurised. When they tested several Comet aircraft to destruction, they found huge cracks originating from the corners of those square windows, and that was the cause of the 2 crashes off Italy.
Britain's entire Comet fleet was grounded while the jetliner went through a radical redesign.
The square windows were eliminated, the fuselage was strengthened, the engines were improved. The Comet became a success at the end, but it went through an awful lot of teething troubles in order to get there. But that was part of the process of learning how a modern jet airliner behaved. Somebody had to do it, somebody had to learn the lessons.
Shortly after the war, the government transferred the short-haul routes of the state-owned airline into a separate organisation called British European Airlines. Long-haul flights were kept under the British Overseas Airways Corporation branding. By the mid-1950s, both carriers were based at Heathrow, now England's major international airport, carrying more than 1 million passengers a year. At the heart of their global operations was a state-of-the-art control centre. The team here would track planes as they carried their customers around the world.
We had chalkboards, movement boards at the front of the office. When the flight departed, we jumped up these steps. We turned a little light on and we chalked up the actual time of departure. When an aircraft landed at Sydney or wherever it was going to, Barbados, one of the duty officers there would send a telex to Heathrow and advise the control centre, and we would turn the light off to denote that the aircraft had actually arrived at that time and wasn't now flying. So the controller could look around the office and he could see all the BOAC flights worldwide that were actually flying.
A decade later, Heathrow was the UK launchpad for a new golden age of air travel. Jetliners were quick and comfortable, while the in-flight service was reaching for the sky. And Britain's airlines were looking for a new kind of cabin crew to fly the flag in the swinging 60s.
Thousands of girls in Britain want to be air hostesses. It's one of the world's top glamour jobs.
I'd always wanted to travel, and I always wondered how I would ever do that, because unless you married somebody rich, how are you going to see the world?
In 1965, the 23-year-old teacher was offered an interview at BOAC.
There were about 20 girls there, all of whom were stunning. That was intimidating. And I just thought, I don't stand any chance here at all. I think they were looking for people who looked good, who would be pleasing on the eye. I know it sounds so superficial now, but that was all part of the ambience of BOAC. We were sitting in groups outside the interview rooms, and people would come up and they'd ask about sex. They'd say, do you have a boyfriend? And, everybody was lying and saying no or yes, but, it's not serious, which is what I said. And then the senior captain said to me, if you were on some palm-fringed beach and some captain approaches you, what are you going to do, my dear? He did actually say my dear like that. So I said to him, well, I've got 3 brothers. I'd realised what was going on. He said, these are not your brothers, my dear. And then I said, it's a bit of a challenge, isn't it? And he said, that's it. So that's what makes me think they were looking for somebody perhaps who was happy-go-lucky but not tacky.
Clean Living Diane made the cut to the final round.
There were about 6 of us out of 20 left, and they said, we'd like to welcome you to BOAC. I was still there. Couldn't believe it. It was extraordinary because I knew that my life would change from then on. It was going to be a big adventure and what I'd always dreamed of, to travel the world.
Diane then headed to Heathrow for the 3-month training course, which would make her a member of airline aristocracy.
Flying staff are picked for intelligence and personality. Training is meticulous. A mock-up of an aircraft cabin is used to give practical experience. Other substitutes can be surprising. Practicing meal service with bottle tops, for instance.
Cabin service was really just fantastic, second to nothing. It really was the best in the world. We used to think we were cut above.
You walked on the aircraft and people were friendly, and people seemed to enjoy flying, and people who were on the cabin crew enjoyed having you. It was much more relaxed. There was no stress to flying.
When people came on board, we would immediately say, "Can I take your coat?" And so we'd be hanging the minks up in the first class, some of which were tried on in secret later.
Passengers generally dressed up to travel. It was a slightly more respectable appearance that was demanded. Chaps would be wearing a jacket and a tie. For a lot of people, it was an event to travel.
In some ways, a 60s long-haul flight was like a meal out at a high-end restaurant.
In first class, the senior steward would roast a leg of lamb or a fillet of beef, and it was his job to carve in front of the passengers.
The food was fantastic, and of course the wines and everything were the finest.
Then would come the trolley with the cheese and the fruit. Some of the cheeses we served, like brie, was considered rare. I mean, in those days, mangoes were rare. Avocados were rare. It sounds funny now because they're fairly commonplace. I mean, I don't know how people ate it all, actually.
The food might have been good, but 50 years ago, BOAC passengers had to make their own fun.
Obviously, there was no in-flight entertainment. People talked to each other, which is slightly surprising these days, perhaps.
People did talk to you, or you could get up and go and have a chat, you know.
There was nothing really except to sit and smoke and read and watch the stewardesses, if you like.
In those days, smoking was allowed on the airplane. There were even some crew members who smoked a pipe.
On transatlantic flights, the thickness of the smoke could signal you were reaching your destination.
If you could not see across the flight deck, you were getting pretty close into New York. Sometimes it was that bad.
And even on the ground, the luxury and glamour didn't end for the flight crews.
In long-haul flying in the 60s, the trips could be anything up to 2, 3, even 4 weeks if you got delays.
We lived in first-class hotels, and you could eat and drink what you wanted. It was all on the account.
Invariably, somebody would say, "Drinks are in my room." So we would have what they call room parties.
It was a 600-mile-an-hour party. It was just great fun.
But nothing lasts forever, particularly in the fast-moving world of aviation.
We weren't allowed to fly if we were pregnant or if we were engaged. So when I got married, I stopped flying, and that was the end of it. But I had satisfied my wanderlust, if you like.
By this time, the party was also coming to an end for Britain's premium carriers. New budget competitors, offering lower-cost package holidays, threatened the mainly European short-haul business. Even though the government did everything it could to protect the scheduled services of its state-owned carrier.
Charter flights weren't allowed to charge more for their tours than the actual cost of a scheduled holiday.
So the charter operators hit back by including transfers to the resort, hotel rooms and meals.
It still might not add up to the expensive scheduled fares which are aimed at business and luxury markets. You'd have to throw in perhaps lots of extras as well, free wine, barbecues, excursions, all those things would be included, and it still might not add up to the price.
While the short-haul business was under threat from low-cost package holiday providers, the long-haul aviation industry was about to be transformed by the launch of the biggest airliner of all time, the Boeing 747 jumbo jet. BOAC brought the supersized double-decker into service in 1971. This was air travel on a scale never seen before.
When you went inside, Christ, I thought I was in a cinema.
The in-flight movie service Britain's flagship airline had pioneered 4 decades earlier finally came as standard. And the original design of the new 747 offered a separate upstairs restaurant and cocktail bar for first-class travellers.
When you're up in that bubble, so you're on a little private plane. You never dreamed there was 300 people down below. It was really a very special experience, the 747.
But the real change was the sheer number of passengers the jumbo jet could carry.
The 747 transformed aviation more than any other aircraft, and I include Concorde in that, because suddenly the largest passenger plane didn't hold just under 200 people, it held over 400, and that meant you had an awful lot more seats to fill. How are we going to do this? Maybe we could cut prices. And that, of course, opened up aviation to the likes of the common man and woman.
By the early 1970s, government-owned British Airlines faced price competition as never before. But this decade would also see the rise of a terrifying new threat to the aviation industry. Five decades after British Airways was born in a field at Hounslow Heath, the nation's flagship carrier would face an unprecedented threat to its global operations. In 1970, after a period of increasing unrest in the Middle East, the violence spilled over to the world's airlines. A new and sinister chapter in the history of international passenger travel opened with a series of coordinated attacks across Europe.
On the 3rd of September 1970, a TWA aircraft out of Frankfurt was hijacked by members of the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. At the same time, a Swiss air flight out of Zurich was hijacked by the same group. There was an attempt to hijack an El Al Israeli 707, which failed because the security guards resisted. They shot one of the hijackers and overpowered the other, the notorious Leila Khaled.
The El Al flight was diverted to Heathrow, where Leila Khaled was arrested by the English police. 3,000 miles away, in Bahrain, teenagers Diane and Malia were getting ready for their BOAC flight back to Britain.
That looks really old now, doesn't it?
It does. It does.
The girls were heading to the UK for the start of a new term at their boarding school. But 3 days after the initial hijackings, the main danger seemed to have passed.
Even though we were 15, at that age, you're still very aware of what's going on in the world. And I knew enough to be a bit anxious about getting on the plane, but it was kind of limited to that, really.
By now, the PFLP was negotiating for the release of Leila Khaled with the British government. But so far, the state-owned airline had managed to keep clear of the crisis.
I think we were rather thinking that BOAC had got away with it.
All that would change shortly after Flight 775 left Bahrain.
A stewardess came running towards the back, looking frightened. And I looked over and I said to you, there are men with guns. And she said, what do you mean guns? And I said, there are men. I think we're being hijacked. And she went, oh, don't be silly.
Back at Heathrow, all hell was about to break loose.
I'd gone to work hoping for a nice quiet shift. And I hadn't been there long when Reuters phoned up. They said, is it true there's been a hijacking? We had a bank of telephone numbers, about 10 on each desk. Immediately, all 10 started ringing.
The Palestinians diverted the VC-10 to Lebanon to refuel.
We were told we were going to go to Beirut Airport. We thought, well, you know, we'll land there and hopefully we'll be able to get off.
We were taxied way past the airport to the end of the runway. I presume, in case they blew us up there. I think that scared me more than anything.
The terrorists then ordered the pilot to fly onto Jordan, where 2 of the planes which had been hijacked earlier in the week were already being held.
As soon as we hit the ground, there was all this sand and it looked like smoke to me, and I thought that was the end then.
The British plane had landed at Dawson's Field, a short, dusty runway under the control of the PFLP. the VC-10 pulled up alongside the Swissair and TWA planes, guarded by heavily armed Palestinians.
The crew were lovely.
They were trying their best to keep us as calm as possible. Everybody realised it could be your last moment, so everybody was as helpful as possible. It seems to be a British thing.
The position of the hostages on the aircraft was extremely precarious. Most came from Western democracies. An intense debate happened about whether to stand up to the hijackers or accede to their demand.
Negotiations dragged on as the hostages sweltered in the heat at Dawson's Field.
They brought that water tank from Damascus and we had to sort of ration it out, so everybody had half a cup of water every couple of hours, was it? Wasn't nice water, but it was water. It was a drink, so it was rationed but tasted awful.
The standoff went on for days.
There was no bigger story in the world.
You could see the TWA plane and the Swissair plane parked. There was nowhere to go as far as you could see. There was nothing, just stony desert.
You couldn't get away from it. You had to just, on the plane, you're stuck with it. There's nothing you can do. You can't try and make a run for it.
Malia and Diane were held on the runway for nearly 60 hours.
The deadlock was broken with a deal in which it was eventually resolved that Layla Khaled would be released.
I think it was all very iffy right up until the last moment. Then we were getting off the plane and it all seemed to happen quite quickly. And then we were aware that some of the men had been left behind.
We were under the impression that they were going to keep them and kill them.
The women and children were taken from the jetliner to the Intercontinental Hotel in nearby Amman.
The noise was horrendous. People were questioning, people were laughing, some people were screaming about their husbands being left.
Back at Dawson's Field, the hijackers blew up the airliners.
We saw the smoke and heard the awful bang. At that point, all I was aware of was that they still had all the men, and I thought they'd blown them up.
It later emerged that the men had been removed from the plane. Eventually, all the hostages were released in exchange for Layla Khaled and 6 others. Malia and Diane finally arrived at Heathrow 4 days after their plane had been taken over by terrorists.
It wasn't until I saw my parents' faces there in front of me that I could relax, that I knew I was okay and safe.
It was my mother and my brother who met me. Yeah, I couldn't stop cuddling them.
I realised that this was not a sea change, an air change in the way of air travel, and it would never be the same again. You were no longer safe as an airline passenger, and I think that's still with us.
British Airways security measures were transformed in the wake of the Black September hijackings. From then on, armed airport patrols and rigorous boarding checks would become part and parcel of international travel. The aviation industry was changing, and the government decided the state-owned airlines would be fitter to face the new challenges under one banner. In April 1974, the British Overseas Airways Corporation and British European Airways merged to form British Airways. Next time, Britain flies the flag with the world's first ever supersonic passenger jet.
This is indeed Concorde's day.
BA faces fierce competition and legal action on the hard-fought transatlantic routes.
Obviously delighted with today's result and hope that it will bring in a new era of fair competition in British aviation.
And chaos at Terminal 5 as the airline unveils its new multi-billion-pound base.